Hello, I'm Dr. Robert Sizer of Roosevelt University, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about vaccination strategies and priorities. This is part of our third module in the series on vaccination science resources. And in this module, in this part, the final part of the third module, is subtitled From Farm to Arm. And I'm going to be talking about the following aspects of vaccine distribution and immunization procedures. First, vaccine production and logistics. I'll take a little bit of a review on how vaccines are made and developed and then brought to market. Vaccination protocols, how the vaccines are actually distributed to people for immunization and how we set priorities for them. We're going to look at risk categories and how those categories are set and addressed. I'll talk a little bit about addressing racial and ethnic disparities and inequalities in immunization. And finally, a bit on quality control and safety monitoring as we see COVID-19 immunization increase in scale and in scope over the coming months. So first, on the matter of vaccine production and logistics, in my previous video, I went through in some detail the vaccine development pipeline, which involves exploratory research, preclinical studies, clinical trials, regulatory approvals, manufacturing, and quality control. Some of those topics overlap with the production and logistics for vaccination itself, because the manufacturing process, of course, comes at the end of the development process, and the regulatory approvals to make sure that the vaccines that are developed are safe and effective also need to extend into the vaccination protocols to make sure that the people who are receiving the vaccines out in daily life, just as during the clinical trials, to make sure that that's done effectively and the vaccines continue to be safe for people to receive, and to make sure that they actually do help confer protective immunity. So there's quality control for vaccination protocols, as well as for the development and initial production of those vaccines. So you see a lot of the same elements, essentially, pre-approval as well as post-approval. As of the beginning of 2021, we have in the United States 2 mRNA vaccines that have gone through the approval process and are now in widespread distribution. Other types of vaccines, both conventional and non-conventional, are being considered and are going through trials here in the US and in other countries. It's thought that widespread vaccine availability should come by the summer of this year. Many millions of doses have already been produced and administered within the United States, and more to come. So this process is ongoing, and each part of the process, as well as each type of vaccine candidate that's been developed and approved, is subject to its own set of requirements, its own manufacturing conditions, and its own sort of special ways of handling and distribution. So regardless of the type of vaccine that's being produced or who's going to get it, there are a number of different stakeholders, a number of different people who have to work together to ensure that the vaccines get out to where they're needed, and that we can keep track of who has received them and so on. So this requires a high degree of collaboration and cooperation among federal and state and local authorities, from the federal government to state governments and departments of public health to local governments, as well as researchers, logistics professionals, hospitals, pharmacists, all manner of healthcare workers and care providers. Lots of people have to be involved in this to help it go as smoothly as possible. One of the initiatives a major initiative at the federal level in the United States was Operation Warp Speed, which was set up in 2020 to help coordinate the development and the distribution and approval of vaccine candidates. So some of the vaccines that are now available were developed specifically with the support of and funding from Operation Warp Speed. Others were developed independently, but still used the resources that were set up for this initiative to help bring them to market. In 2021, we will be seeing, in all likelihood, some changes to the national program for vaccine distribution and record keeping and so on. But Operation Warp Speed is the group that was formed in 2020 to get this process, and it was done in recognition of the fact that being able to combat the COVID-19 pandemic was going to require sort of an unparalleled degree of collaboration among many different agencies and groups, and that remains true now and going forward. Outside of the US, other countries have their own partnerships and approval processes and different ways that vaccine manufacturers and scientists and public health experts and government officials are working together to help get vaccines distributed in their countries. It's difficult to overstate the complex nature of making and distributing vaccines. The manufacturing process can be complex, even for a so-called simple or relatively straightforward vaccine like the mRNA vaccines that have been approved so far. And that's because we're working with biological materials, which means that you have to have very high quality components. You have to have very specific manufacturing processes. You have to make sure that everything is produced in the quantities that you need, but that you have a high degree of quality assurance all throughout. And that requires specialized equipment, high quality biochemicals, specific procedures for production and purification, and so on and so forth. So in the image that you see here on the right, this is a number of small bioreactors, the types of equipment that are used for various aspects of vaccine production, as well as making lots of other types of biological materials, including drugs and therapeutics and so on. And these bioreactors are very tightly controlled environments where specific components can be added and removed at various times and quantities. You can have very specific temperature and pressure and pH settings and lots of different things going on with them. So when you have to produce something as extensive and as abundant as the vaccines that are going to be going out for production, you have to be able to have all of this highly controlled manufacturing taking place at a very large scale. So this can be complex. And if there are things that will require sort of special treatment or special handling in any way, it means that you have to be able to carry that through the process to make sure that you can go from manufacturing through distribution, through administration of the vaccine, and make sure that that's all been handled to make sure that the vaccine is effective. So when it comes to making mRNA vaccines, which is one of the new types of non-conventional vaccines that are now available, and again, the first to be approved for widespread distribution in the United States, there are just a few steps to them, but again, each one is subject to its own controls and its own very specific way of doing things. In the first major step, the DNA that encodes the spike protein for the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus is produced in large quantities with the help of recombinant bacteria. Those bacteria get the viral DNA and make large quantities of it. They just make many copies of it. And that DNA is then purified and it's used as the basis of mRNA production. So the DNA is the genomic material that encodes for mRNA. And that mRNA is then made in large quantities, again purified, and that is placed inside inside the lipid nanoparticles, which make up the heart of the mRNA vaccine. So a little bit of DNA for a portion of a protein from the virus goes into a bacterium. The bacteria makes more DNA. The DNA is then transcribed into mRNA, and it's that mRNA that goes into the lipid nanoparticles. Those then are given to us, injected as the vaccine, and our cells use that mRNA as a template to make protein. So we make little bits of the viral spike protein, and that becomes the message that is sent to, or the signal that is sent to the cells in our immune system that we have been, quote unquote, infected. So that when we might encounter the full active SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus in the future, we should already have antibodies and memory cells that can recognize the spike protein on the outside of the live virus and can mount an immune response that can keep us from infection and from illness. So making this vaccine requires these steps, and requires them to be done in pretty large scales in order to make hundreds of millions of doses of these vaccines for distribution. So for this vaccine, as well as for any biologics production, the producers need to make sure that at least 6 different things are done right. You need to have the right product. That is something that is made to be what you want it to be. It needs to be made in the right quantities so that it can be distributed to everybody who needs it. And they need to be in the right condition, which means that the vaccine has to arrive in a state where it can be effective, and it can be given to people with confidence that it will work and that they will develop immunity to COVID-19 because they've gotten it. It needs to be delivered to the right place and at the right time. So the logistics part of it means figuring out where people who are the highest priorities will be, and how to get the vaccine to them and make it available for them to be immunized. And of course, it has to be at the right cost. And a priority, of course, for COVID-19 vaccination is that the vaccine should be made available for free to everyone. So the cost is borne not by the person who is going to get the shot, but by the government, and by in collaboration with the companies who are doing the production, so that they can get paid. Then they can pay their own employees to make the vaccine, but that cost will not go to the individual in order for them to receive it. And in some cases, we've heard about companies that are actually paying their employees to receive the vaccinations, so that there's a financial incentive rather than a financial cost to getting immunized. As an example of one of these challenges, and something that has to be gotten right, the mRNA vaccines that I'm talking about need to be kept cold. So mRNA is not a particularly stable molecule, at least not the RNA that's being used as the basis for these vaccines. So they are very effective. They're not terribly difficult to produce, although they have to be done in high quantities and with high quality, but they do need to be kept cold so that they can retain their effectiveness. So that places extra importance on what we call the cold chain, being able to ensure that from end to end, from manufacture to distribution and administration, that the vaccine is kept very cold, like below freezing, below freezer freezing cold. So we rely on on the expertise of the manufacturers and the companies that are charged with distribution and storage and so on. And that makes these vaccines somewhat more limited than other types of vaccines have been, in the sense that they can really only be distributed to places that have the capacity to keep them in this ultra cold state. So they start out in manufacture. They're in a storage warehouse, which is called a freezer farm. Then they go into specialized shipping cases for regional distribution, and then into smaller shipping cases for local distribution. And these vaccines are likely to go and are going to clinical sites, pharmacies, hospitals. And this makes sense, and it works out well, because the people who are essentially first in line to receive them are people who are residents of long-term care facilities, the elderly in assisted living, and of course healthcare workers and so on. So people who would be either working in or very close to medical centers and clinical care areas where these low temperature freezers would be available. Using an mRNA vaccine is going to be a bit more of a challenge when you have larger numbers of people, including the general public, wanting to get these vaccines, because of the need to store them at these low temperatures. It can make it harder and less accessible to people who might only be able to go to a neighborhood pharmacy or to a pop-up clinic or something like that in order to get vaccinated. So that is one of the challenges that is presented by this particular type of vaccine. Other types of vaccines will have their own challenges with respect to storage and stability and effectiveness and so on that need to be dealt with as well. So again, regardless of the vaccine type and how it's made and how it's distributed, when it gets to the point where it can be administered, the appropriate vaccination protocols or procedures need to be carried out. Each vaccine has its own recommended dose. Some of them will require single doses. Others are likely to require multiple doses or boosters, sometimes taken weeks or months apart, to make sure that the immune system can make a full response. So in order to be able to stimulate a secondary immune response of the magnitude that's necessary to really show that protective immunity has been conferred, some of these vaccines will require doses, several weeks apart. So whenever you're making a vaccine for someone, then you need to make sure that you're making and distributing 2 doses at the appropriate intervals, and be sure that the person can come back and get their second shot when they need to. So this influences how we think about risk categories and prioritizing who should be getting the vaccine. So there's guidance from the federal government, and there is guidance from state and sometimes local departments of public health about whom they're going to put into different risk categories or vaccination priority groups. Some of the things that then will influence these categorizations include the availability of the vaccines, as I mentioned previously, people's access to the vaccine, their risk of infection and severe disease, and their risk of transmission to others. So you may have heard some conversations about whether young people who are at lower risk of having severe symptoms from COVID-19 and a lower risk of death from COVID-19 should get higher priority, or should get different priority for vaccination, because they are a higher risk of transmission to other people. And this is especially going to be a consideration as we look at new variants of COVID-19, as the virus that causes it is subject to mutations. Another factor is the risk of infection and severe disease. Again, there have been some conversations about whether people who are smokers and already at risk of, or maybe in the early stages of lung disease, should have higher priority for vaccination, because they are at a much higher risk of infection and severe complications of COVID-19. Based on what we have seen from the CDC, and from state health officials. Here is a sort of general breakdown or set of recommendations for the current risk categories and prioritizations. Right now, as of the recording of this video, most places are in phase 1A, where healthcare workers, long-term care facility residents are getting vaccinated. So they are the top priority. This can also include people like first responders and others who might be at the highest risk categories for exposure. That's estimated to be almost 18 million people in the United States. And as of this recording in early January or mid-January, we've seen about 11 million people vaccinated. In phase 1B, that's likely to include essential workers, including those who are not in healthcare. It can be people, again, who are at higher risk of exposure because they work in a place where they have a lot of contact with other people. And just by including these essential workers, that number, the number of people who potentially fall into this category goes up to over 80 million. Phase 1C is going to include seniors 65 years and older, other high-risk individuals. This can include, again, people working in other sectors of the economy, educators, and others who are coming in contact with children or working in places where there's likely to be disease spread currently. And this could include more than 100 million people in the United States. So essentially the later phases, whenever we may get to them, are reserved for people, for younger adults and for children who are currently at the lowest risk of severe illness or of transmission of the virus and of complications related to COVID-19. So clearly there's a lot of need for vaccines to be distributed in large numbers as soon as possible, and this is an attempt to try to prioritize these based on these different considerations. We also know that there are different ethnic groups are differentially affected by COVID-19, such that Black and Hispanic populations in particular are seeing much higher rates of case positivity and severe illness and death related to other populations in the U.S. So this is clearly a concern and an issue for prioritization as well when vaccines are made available in these later phases. Overall, the goals for vaccination are pretty obvious. You've seen in these and other videos about the need for protective immunity and reaching herd immunity, so that we can begin to return back to some kind of normal state where we can be much more sure that our regular interactions with each other will not lead to transmission of the virus. So decreasing, death and serious disease is obviously a huge #1 goal for vaccination. Some of the other vaccination goals are to reduce the burden of disease on people who already face disparities, such as the people I talked about in my discussion of the priorities on the last slide. Increasing the chance for everybody to be healthy and well, and ultimately preserving the function of our society. It has changed our society in incalculable ways, and we need to get to protective immunity for all the benefits that it can convey for just how we live our lives. So in order to do that, we are going to need to continue to distribute and use the mRNA vaccines that have already shown to be highly effective and are now being rolled out. We're going to need other types of vaccines. We're going to need to be able to see what people actually will need. Considering that the virus is now endemic in our population, it might be necessary for people to receive regular vaccinations, such as we now do for the influenza virus. And these will have to be rolled out over time in order to achieve protective immunity or herd immunity worldwide. And as we see new variants emerging, we might actually have to seek to have an even higher level of herd immunity at the 75 or 80 or even 85% level among the population as a whole, in order to be sure that we can stop the spread of the virus. And we have to keep in mind that these vaccines need to be distributed safely and equitably. We cannot prioritize, we should not prioritize on the basis of an ability to pay or other ways of gaining access, other than those carefully considered risk categories and priorities that we've already talked about. Current estimates are that about 25% of the world population might not have vaccine access of any kind until 2022, and maybe even later than that. So again, we cannot limit ourselves to just what happens here in the United States. We need to look globally and make sure that that same emphasis on safety, on protection, and on equity of distribution is something that we see everywhere in the world, because this is truly a global situation, a global pandemic. As we go forward, we're also going to have to keep an eye on quality control and safety monitoring. And in the United States, we do already have some robust mechanisms in place in order to monitor the quality and the safety and the efficacy of vaccines, not just those for SARS-CoV-2, but for anything else that's already out there as part of the normal child immunization plans or adult immunization schedules. So some of those systems include the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, VSD, the Post-Licensure Rapid Immunization Safety Monitoring, PRISM system, and the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Project, or CISA project. And all of these, again, are meant to be able to collect information about vaccine distribution and vaccine safety, and have that go back to regulatory agencies and authorities, as well as to manufacturers and researchers, to make sure that people are receiving vaccines the way they ought to receive them, to monitor any potential side effects or complications of having been immunized, and to give information that can be used to make even safer and more effective vaccines in the future. So I want to close with this idea. This whole set of materials has been about vaccines and about vaccine development and how vaccines affect the immune system, and so on and so forth. And what I'd like to do with this is just sort of place these into the context of the broader set of responses and mitigations for the coronavirus. So this is called the Swiss cheese respiratory virus pandemic defense, and it lists 10 different types of activities that can help to mitigate or defend against the spread of this virus. You'll notice that vaccines are all the way over on the right, and that is considered to be sort of the last and potentially most effective line of defense. But there's a lot of things that come before it, and it's called the Swiss cheese defense because every different type of mitigation or intervention has its limitations, and you can think of those as the holes in the Swiss cheese. But if you put them all together, you are greatly decreasing the likelihood that the virus will spread. So to protect yourself and to protect others, you can take part in these different types of interventions, everything from physical distancing to masks to better hygiene, and then moving on to the types of shared responsibilities that we have for quarantining, government responsibilities, adequate ventilation and air filtration, so on and so forth, ultimately to having a vaccine that is effective and widely available. The more layers you have between you and the virus, the better protected you are. And that's worth keeping in mind, because we all ultimately bear some responsibilities. So our one sentence summary for this video is that immunity is a community responsibility, and that vaccines are a huge part of it, but we all bear some responsibility in making sure that people are safe and that we can keep ourselves safe as well until we all get through this. So we as community members, working with health professionals and first responders, caregivers, with researchers, with manufacturers, with logistics specialists, and with government agencies of various types, are all working together to help us to develop these vaccines and bring them as we say, from freezer farm to arm, so that we can build that protective immunity for everyone's sake. Thanks again for watching this video and for taking a look at all the videos in this module and throughout the series. I hope you found them helpful and informative, and I appreciate any feedback that you'd like to provide. Thanks very much.